Good morning, everybody. Matt Johnson here, the director and founder of the West Grey Virtual Museum. And I just want to welcome you to the first of what I hope is a lot of great programming here at the museum. And one thing I'm very adamant about as a historian is, we're going to talk about West Grey. This is the West Grey Museum, but where does West Grey fit into the Canadian story? Where does West Grey fit into the world story? So it's very appropriate then this morning, we're going to be talking about the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which of course was April 9th, 1917. And I'm outside here on this beautiful morning. It's cold as heck, kind of fitting. Vimy Ridge wasn't in the nicest of weather, although the sun's out here. So it's a little bit nicer, but if you enjoy this program, please tell your friends, please tell your family to like the West Grey Museum, and we'll eventually be able to do some live broadcasts. And when we talk about Vimy Ridge today, this is not the Vimy Ridge Masterclass, okay? This is the Vimy Ridge basics. If you want to compare it to a cooking class, this is the Vimy Ridge. This is how to make craft dinner, not how to make a fancy creme brulee dessert. So this is the basics of Vimy Ridge today. And I mean, if you ever want to know a little bit more about Vimy Ridge, or if you ever want to talk World War I, I'm always here. Shoot me a message on the West Grey Museum page, or email me. I'm always happy to talk about it. So I think let's dive right into the Battle of Vimy Ridge here. So I really feel that this is a great time to be talking about Vimy Ridge with all the increased nationalism, if you will, in Canada right now, of course, due to factors from south of the border. We're not going to get into politics, but it's become very, very important to recognize how Canadian we are, and Canadians are again becoming very patriotic to be Canadian and to not be American. So I think it's a great time to talk about the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which is really an iconic moment in Canadian, not only Canadian military history, but Canadian history in general. And, a lot of people say that Canada became a nation on April 9th, 1917 at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And I do tend to agree with that. I think it was probably the first time Canada stepped up on the world stage in a massive way. And of course, we're going to talk a little bit about why that happened. Being as this was going to be a live broadcast, I'm still doing this as a live broadcast, by the way. So I might even stop and have some sips of my coffee here, because it is actually quite freezing out here. So as we talk today, this is just like it would be live. So one take, coffee breaks, maybe mess up a few things, but here we go. So Vimy Ridge. So what we have to look at sort of is the overall picture of where the war was in the spring of 1917. So rewind all the way back to August 1914. Europe is they call it a tinderbox. It's ready to blow, and it does. And through a lot of chain reactions we're not going to get into, that's a whole nother masterclass. Germany through neutral Belgium, swings into France. Their plan is to knock France out of the war almost immediately, so they can turn their attention to the Russians on the Eastern Front. So Germany comes plowing through Belgium, through northern France, and they have a lot of success originally. The Belgians do hold them up a little bit, and then they run into the BEF, or the British Expeditionary Force at Mons, and they fight a really sharp battle there with the British force, and the British are defeated, but they do hold the Germans up. They inflict serious casualties and kind of throw the German timetable off, if you will. But the German advance does continue through, if you can picture France, through northern France, and sort of like a wheel down towards Paris. And at the last minute, the Germans, instead of enveloping Paris, kind of changed their overall strategy a bit and scored in front of Paris. And the Allies then hit them back at what we call the Battle of the Marne. And that was sort of the miracle in the Marne, if you will, stopped the German advance. So by the fall of 1914, the Germans are stopped. They have a lot of northern France in their power, but the Allies push back. So the Allies and the Germans then start a chain reaction of trying to go around each other's flank to the north, essentially, until they run into the English Channel. So by Christmas 1914, we see a continual trench line. I don't have the numbers in front of me, again, live broadcast, I forget what it is, but let's say a 1,000-mile long continuous front from the North Sea right to Switzerland. And both sides are dug in, and they're digging in because they're there to stay, and there is no way neither side can break the deadlock. So both sides are dug in. It's a big siege, and the reason we can't break the deadlock in 1914 is that the power of defensive weaponry greatly exceeds the power of offensive weaponry that is available. So we see things like machine guns, we see quicker firing artillery, and we start to see barbed wire. So these things greatly hinder any attempts at attacks. So by the start of 1915, we're dug in across the front. Of course, we have April 1915. The Germans, they try a revolutionary new tactic in warfare, and at the Second Battle of Ypres, they release poison gas. And of course, the poison gas hits the French lines. The French troops, very understandably, essentially break and run. And the Canadians sort of stepped into that breach. So 1st Canadian Division has been in the field for a few months, and the Canadians at the First Battle of Ypres really step into that breach, Second Battle of Ypres, really step into that breach and hold the Germans there. So that's sort of our first taste of combat in the spring of 1915. And the 1st Division is basically crippled in that battle. They've suffered extreme amount of casualties, and they're a little while rebuilding. But by the end of 1915 and moving into 1916, Canada has 3 divisions in the field of the Canadian Corps. So blast ahead to the summer of 1916, the British have the big push planned. We're going to have the big push that's going to end the war, and this is where we see the Battle of the Somme. And in the summer of 1916, the French are fighting a super intense battle in the southern part of the line, southern central part of the line, around the fortress town of Verdun. And it's a very intense battle. Germany and France just keep throwing divisions in, and it's a madhouse. So the French are really adamant the British have to take the pressure off Verdun, and General Haig has been planning a big offensive. Britain underwent a big increase in their military through 1915 because the original force Britain had was small, and it was essentially destroyed in 1914. So by the summer of 1916, we have all these new British divisions, all young, raw, essentially recruits coming into the front line. And on July 1st, 1916, the BEF, British Expeditionary Force, launches what would become known as the Battle of the Somme. And the Battle of the Somme is known for futility. Essentially, it represents a lot of the things that were wrong with the war. The first day of the battle, the British suffered something like 20,000 dead in one morning. Like, it was just crazy casualties. Again, I don't have the numbers right in front of me because this is a live broadcast, but it's where we get these iconic images of soldiers going over the top, lining up essentially in lines, and marching into the German machine guns. It seems crazy now. Maybe it was a little crazy. That's not exactly how it happened. There was actually some successful parts on the Battle of the Somme on July 1st, 1916, but essentially it did represent the futility of trying to attack fortified, dug-in positions with the infantry. There was just no firepower there at the sharp end, if you will. So the Battle of the Somme drags on from July 1st, 1916, well into the fall, and the Canadians do fight there in September and October 1916, and they're bloodied. They do have some success, but they do suffer a lot of casualties. But one thing is about the Battle of the Somme is we do learn some lessons. So by 1917, winter of 1917, the Western Front is pretty much still, it hasn't moved a lot. It's from the North Sea down to Switzerland. Verdun and the Somme haven't changed a whole heck of a lot positionally, but we do see, as I mentioned, lessons learned. Both sides are learning lessons. So when the Canadians take over the Vimy sector, it's ugly, because so far there's been fighting there since 1914. The French have tried to take the hill. The French did take the hill, did take Vimy Ridge temporarily. The Germans did throw them off. So by the time the Canadians get there in 1917, we see the Vimy Ridge sector is, for lack of a better word, disgusting. Because of 2.5 years of warfare there, there's unburied bodies, there's corpses rotting everywhere. No man's land is terrible. It's muddy. It's just generally a really ugly place to be. And the Canadians move in there, and with the knowledge that they're eventually going to have to capture this ridge, which has basically been impregnable since the start of the war. Germans were incredibly well dug in on Vimy Ridge. The reverse slope of Vimy Ridge, they had reserve positions, they had bunkers, they had heavy artillery throughout the area behind, as well as they had counterattacking forces billeted throughout the villages behind Vimy itself. So if the Allies did break in to the positions, as the French had done, these counterattacking forces could drive them off the ridge. So the Canadians step into a very heavily defended position, but they know what their job's going to be, and they go to work. And the Canadians realize that one of the things we've realized from the Somme is that preparation. You know, our artillery is going to save lives here. And we saw at the Battle of the Somme where the British thought the artillery was sufficient to destroy the German positions on especially the first day, which remains sort of the iconic. It wasn't. Artillery needed better fuses, which they didn't have in 1916, but they were getting by 1917. And the big factor with artillery that really hurt on the Somme was not so much what the Allied artillery wasn't doing, it was what the German artillery was doing, essentially. So what you would see in the Somme was there would be a successful attack on a frontline position, and say the British or Canadians would drive the Germans out, so the Germans fall back on another position. But then the Allies cannot support that advance because the German artillery now, it's no secret what's happening, they're pounding no man's land with shells. So basically you break into the German lines, suddenly you're cut off from your lines. The Germans, no man's land is a place you can't be, and the Germans will drive you out of the position or just simply surround you and basically wait you out and wipe you out or capture the British soldiers, Canadian soldiers. So what we see at Vimy Ridge is a big rethought, if you will, about how artillery is used. And a lot of things have been developed as far as techniques for spotting where German artillery batteries are located. So one thing the Canadians and the British realize we need to do at Vimy Ridge is we need to destroy the German artillery positions as best we can, because it's a hill, we need to be able to capture a position, reinforce, capture the next position, reinforce, capture the next position. So the best way to do this is we have to definitely get rid of that German artillery. So that is definitely part number one of what the Canadians start to do at Vimy Ridge that's better, as we really have developed a lot of great techniques with the British and the French for finding German batteries behind the lines. And this is the Royal Flying Corps. Of course, they're spotting German batteries, but we're also using techniques called flash spotting and range sounding. And again, that's a whole other thing. But by the winter of 1917, early spring, the Canadians and British have pretty much identified where all the German batteries of artillery are behind the lines. Now, some of these batteries are going to be hit with shell fire before the attack on Vimy Ridge, but some of them they're going to wait until just before the attack because they don't want the Germans to know that they know where they are, so the Germans move the artillery. So by the winter of 1917, we're getting into late winter, we know where all this artillery is. It's all spotted. It's all going to be hopefully destroyed. And the Canadians bring in just a ridiculous amount of guns. Again, live broadcast, don't have the number in front of me, but thousands of artillery pieces, and they are just going to absolutely saturate the German lines in the weeks leading up to Vimy Ridge, during the attack on Vimy Ridge, and then of course after the attack on Vimy Ridge to prevent German counterattacks. So the artillery plays a huge role in the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And you know, you could argue, and a lot of historians do argue, that the First World War was an artillery war, and I would definitely agree with that. So we see then by the winter we have artillery, an artillery fire plan worked out, but that still doesn't really help the Canadians on the ground, if you will, the frontline infantry. So several things again were learned at the Somme, and one of the things that was definitely learned at the Somme was that attacking infantry needed to have more firepower, and attacking infantry needed to have more ability to be flexible in their tactics, right down to the individual soldier. So what we saw at the Somme and earlier in the war a lot was the overall battle plan wasn't necessarily shared below, say the company level, if you will, the battalion level. So at the Somme particularly, we saw a lot of times where a British attack would be making okay progress, but then the officers would be killed or wounded or incapacitated somehow. The soldiers would go to ground and the attack was done. So, and that was not because they weren't brave, it wasn't because they weren't good soldiers, it was simply because they didn't know what was the objectives, what was, you know, where are we going, other than we're going there. So by the time Vimy Ridge comes around, one thing that is really crucial that the Canadians have done and throughout the BEF is these plans are disseminated down through the ranks. So right down to the private soldier, he knows that his objective is here at this time on this day. So, and we do see this at Vimy Ridge when officers do start getting killed. We do see, privates and NCOs taking over units. So sergeants and corporals suddenly are in charge of a company, for example, or something like that, because everybody knows their job. So we have now a situation where the Canadians, we have the artillery laid out. By the late winter, early spring 1917, we start disseminating these battle plans through the soldiers, and the officers start familiarizing themselves with their objectives. And we're doing things like we have massive terrain models in behind the lines that the officers are studying. And we actually start rehearsing the battle. Canadian assault battalions actually are rehearsing the battle behind the lines in fields marked out to best simulate the German positions as they can. And so we're rehearsing these timed battles, we're rehearsing everything going on. So we have the soldiers know what's going on, we have the German artillery really targeted, and we're going to destroy it. And it's just really coming together as a unit, the Canadian Corps. And now there's several other things we have to take into consideration here. One of the things that the Somme was not just the frontline soldiers necessarily getting killed, it was the support soldiers. So we see things in Vimy Ridge like the Canadians are digging tunnels to get soldiers up to the front lines. So they're not even exposed to fire until they get into the front lines. So we see lots of innovations that were paid for in the blood of the first couple of years of the war. But we see them starting to come to light at Vimy Ridge, and really going along with the filtering down of information through the fighting formations. We also see another lesson, learned at the Somme was the infantry did not have enough firepower at the front. Break into a position, German position, and the infantry only has rifles. We got, our pockets are jammed full of grenades. We don't have a lot more. We start seeing some machine guns at that point. The Lewis gun comes into play. But one change we make is by 1917, we see the infantry companies and the infantry platoons have a lot more firepower at the sharp end, a lot more ability to hold, and a lot more flexible tactics. So we now start to see things like each platoon has a Lewis gun, each platoon has a bombing section, each platoon has rifle grenades. So we start seeing the ability of the infantry to have flexible tactics, and the ability of the infantry to really fight back and hold positions and hit hard when they have to attack these positions. So we're really in a much better place as a fighting force by the start of April 1917 than we were at the end of 1916, Battle of the Somme. So live broadcast, I'm stopping for a coffee break. I have to have a drink here because that's a lot of talking in a row. Okay. So, Canadian Corps, spring 1917, we have 4 divisions. 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, ironically. And we're commanded by a really excellent British officer named Julian Byng. And he's, at first he didn't even understand why he was being sent to the Canadian Corps. He famously said, I don't even know a Canadian when they sent him there, but the Canadians soon learned to love Byng, and he was a tremendous officer. He went on to command a British army. But under him, there is 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps, there's 4 divisional commanders in the Canadian Army, and the Canadian 1st Division was commanded by a young officer born in Strathroy, Ontario, named Arthur Currie. And Arthur Currie was seen as probably the most promising officer in the Canadian Corps, and he was recognized by his superiors as well as right up to General Haig as being a very promising officer. And after the Battle of the Somme, what happened was the armies talked. So the British armies talked, the French armies talked, everybody talked, and Arthur Currie went on a tour, if you will, with a bunch of other British officers throughout to talk to the French, essentially. And they learned a lot of things about attacking. They learned a lot of things about artillery usage. So we start seeing, we see Arthur Currie really picking up a lot of momentum here as sort of really being behind Vimy Ridge. He's learned a lot of lessons, and we're going to apply them to Vimy Ridge. So even though Julian Byng is the commander of the Corps, he's really leaning on Arthur Currie to really do a lot here at Vimy Ridge, and it really is a test for Currie. And as we see after the Battle of Vimy Ridge, Arthur Currie does eventually go on to command the Canadian Corps once Julian Byng goes to command a British army. So one of the things Currie learned and the British learned and was really disseminated at the Battle of the Somme was something called the creeping barrage. And the creeping barrage is exactly what it sounds like. It was used on the Somme, okay, but we perfected a lot better by 1917. So what the creeping barrage is essentially timed lifts of shell fires. So what happened at the Somme was that the German front line would be hit with artillery, hit, boom, 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 and then the guns would stop because they didn't want to hit their own soldiers in the attack. So if you're a German hiding in a bunker and suddenly the guns have stopped, game on. You're running up to the top of your stairs, getting your machine gun, and there's the Allied infantry has to cross no man's land. As we see at the Somme, it didn't work out well. So what a creeping barrage is essentially a barrage that lifts toward the German lines in scheduled lifts. It was usually different. I want to say, I'm not even going to say what the numbers were, but it was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 yards every 5 minutes. I should know that. I don't know that. I can look it up. But the infantry knew this, the artillery knew this. So let's use 5 minutes for an example. Let's use 3 minutes for an example. Every 3 minutes, the barrage would lift another 100 yards ahead. So the infantry attacking the German positions, what the thought was they'd be right behind this barrage. And once they got to the German positions, as soon as that barrage moved off the German positions, the infantry would be on the German soldiers and not give them time to come up out of their bunkers. And we really, really, really perfect this fire plan for the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And it's incredibly crucial to the story of the battle because it does allow the Canadian soldiers to get right up to the German lines, into the German lines before the German soldiers have time to really collect themselves, if you will. And so leading up to April 9th, we do see this. So we see in the early days of April, late March, early April, we see the artillery really start to step up its game here. And that's when we start hitting some of these German batteries. So we're hitting these German batteries, we're hitting these German frontline positions relentlessly. It's called drum fire, if you will, I've heard we call it, but the shells just don't stop. They're just boom, 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 hitting all the German lines. And when I talk about explosions, these aren't little explosions. The general field gun of the British Army is the 18-pound field gun. It fires a pretty heavy shell. I don't know the blast radius of it or the science, but they're big shells. Big shells, they make big craters. But we've also got heavier guns behind the lines. So we have heavy batteries lobbing huge shells on German positions leading up to April 9th. And of course, it's just hell to be a German soldier at this time. They are in their bunkers, their positions, but just the concussion of the shells alone would have been absolutely terrible. And so they're enduring this shell fire, but they know something's coming, and it's no surprise. And these are good German soldiers opposing the Canadians. They're good divisions. They handle the shell fire, but they're ready to fight in the morning of April 9th. So if you look at Vimy Ridge, if we're facing east, we have the ridge kind of rises a little bit toward the north. So then we have those Canadian divisions arrayed essentially right to left. We have the 1st Division, 2nd Division, 3rd Division, and 4th Division. And these divisions, each one, basically the 1st Division has the furthest to go because it's the less steep part of the ridge. The 2nd Division, a little less because we're starting to get into the hill. The 3rd Division, and the 4th Division doesn't have far to go, but they have to go right uphill 145, which is where the monument is now, and a little rise to the northeast of that called the Pimple. So the 4th Division has the hardest time. And this bombardment starts in the morning. It's been going, but then right at the last minute before the Canadians go over the top, every gun opens up. We start hitting these German batteries that have been noted but not targeted until this point. So we start hitting these. We start hitting the German frontline trenches. We start hitting the German reserve positions so they can't move reinforcements up. And the Canadians go over the top behind the creeping barrage. And this works very well. And the Canadians at Vimy Ridge use a technique called leapfrogging, if you will. And what that is is the Canadian assault waves will go. There was four German defense lines, four German objective lines for the Canadian forces, and essentially with the leapfrogging, the assaulting force would attack and capture the first position, and then the next units would essentially pass through that to capture the next position and the next position. So you're always feeding fresh troops in. You're not asking these guys to attack this position and then continue attacking and continue attacking. These guys are leapfrogging up, and it works well. The Canadians hit hard. The artillery barrage does its job, and the first 3 divisions have captured all their objectives on Vimy Ridge that day, and the last one to hold out was up on Hill 145, and that's where we see late in the day a Nova Scotia regiment, the 85th Battalion, I believe it was. They're just at Vimy Ridge to work. They're just at Vimy Ridge. They're digging trenches and stuff, and they haven't quite captured Hill 145, which is extremely strongly held. And near the end of the day, General Watson, the division commander of the 4th Division, he brings the 85th into line, and they attack the extremely strongly held German positions. Don't forget, these guys just thought they were there to work, so they're not quite ready for battle, and they overrun it. So we see by the end of the day on April 9th, the majority of Vimy Ridge is in Canadian hands. There is positions on the Pimple, if you will, that don't actually fall until April 12th. So by the April 12th, Canadians control the entire Vimy Ridge. So basically we see the Canadians have attacked a ridge using up-to-date tactics and using things that were hard lessons learned on the Somme, and the Canadians capture the ridge. And of course, because of the artillery fire we've worked on, the Germans can't take it back. Anytime that there's any sort of counterattack, even beginning to look like it might happen, the Canadians are able to call down just phenomenal amounts of artillery to break up those. It's cold out here. Break up those attacks. So the Canadians are firmly entrenched at the top of Vimy Ridge, and basically they stay there. It's an almost unassailable position, if you will, for the Germans at that point, and they do pull back. So we see by later in the spring 1917, there is more fighting in that region, but of course that summer and that fall, we see the Canadian Corps pulled out then of Vimy Ridge, and they would go north to fight at the Battle of Passchendaele, which might be a whole nother topic here sometime, maybe this fall we'll talk about Passchendaele.